The shovel hit the earth with a sound that cracked through the dry Kansas air like a gunshot, and Annie Sutton felt her breath leave her body entirely. Edgar Chandler was standing at the edge of the finished root cellar, the very root cellar she had begged him to build, the one she had drawn out in careful pencil lines on the back of a flour sack and pressed into his calloused hands 6 weeks ago. And he was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes of his in a way that she had never allowed herself to expect. Not from him, not from any man who had ever come within arm's reach of the secrets she carried. "I want to know," he said, his voice low and even, the way a man speaks when he is choosing every word with the same care he uses to drive a nail straight. "I built the root cellar you asked for, and now I am asking you, Annie, what else are you planning to grow?" The question hung between them in the hot July air of 1882, and Annie felt something she had not felt in 3 years of widowhood and westward flight. She felt absolutely, completely cornered, because the answer was not carrots. It was not turnips. It was not the winter squash she had mentioned so casually to the women at the church social, the ones who kept their eyes too wide and their mouths too tight whenever Annie Sutton walked by. The answer was something that lived in the cedar box under her floorboards, something that could unravel every careful lie she had constructed around herself since the morning she had buried her name in Missouri and walked across the state line with nothing but a carpetbag and a determination as hard and polished as river stone. Edgar's jaw was set. His shirt was dark with sweat from 3 weeks of digging, shoring, and framing. He had done everything she asked. He had asked nothing in return. And now, standing at the mouth of what he had built with his own hands, he was asking this one thing, and the look in his eyes told her he already knew the root cellar was not the whole story. Annie opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the cellar door, heavy pine planks, iron hinges he had forged himself, and then she looked back at Edgar Chandler, and for the first time in 3 years, Annie Sutton made the most terrifying decision of her life. She told him the truth. But to understand what the truth was, you have to understand how Annie Sutton came to be standing in the dust of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Friday afternoon in the summer of 1882, with a root cellar full of fresh-turned earth and a heart full of everything she had never meant to plant there. It had started on a Tuesday in March, the kind of March that Kansas does with no apology, cold 1 hour, warm the next, the wind shifting directions like a man who cannot decide which way he wants to walk. Annie had arrived on the southbound stage from Wichita with $43, a box of seed catalogs, and the deed to 80 acres of land she had purchased sight unseen from a man named Horace Pruett, who had placed an advertisement in the Missouri Courier under the heading, "Farmland for Sale, South Kansas, Reasonable Terms, No Questions." No questions had suited Annie perfectly. She had made the arrangement through a letter, sent the deposit by bank draft, and arrived with the remaining balance in a small leather pouch she kept inside her corset because she did not trust the lock on her carpetbag. Horace Pruett had met her at the stage depot, handed over the deed and a rough map drawn in pencil, told her the well was functional but the house wanted work, and driven away in his buckboard with the look of a man who was relieved to be rid of something. The house did not merely want work. The house needed the kind of intervention that bordered on spiritual. 2 windows were gone entirely. The door hung from one hinge. The floor in the kitchen had a soft spot near the stove that promised to collapse at the first serious winter. But the land, 80 acres of flat, rich, dark Kansas soil, that was exactly what the catalog had described. And the land was what Annie had come for. She had grown up on a farm in Illinois before the war made her father something harder and quieter than the man she remembered. She understood soil. She understood what could be hidden in it and what could be coaxed from it with patience and attention and a willingness to work before the sun was fully up. She had learned to read a field the way some women read faces, noting the color and the density and the way it broke apart between her fingers, and the 80 acres outside Caldwell, Kansas, told her everything she needed to know within the first 10 minutes of walking it. This could be a life. She had moved into the broken house, repaired what she could with what she had, made peace with the rest, and begun introducing herself to Caldwell with the careful modesty of a woman who wanted to be seen as ordinary. She attended services at the First Methodist Church on Sundays. She bought her goods at Hartwell's dry goods store and paid cash without complaint. She accepted the social invitations of Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who organized the church auxiliary and made it her personal mission to know the business of every woman within 20 miles. What Annie did not do in those first weeks was ask for help. Not until Edgar Chandler's fence line and her fence line became a matter of some discussion. The property lines on Horace Pruett's map were, Annie discovered, approximately optimistic. The eastern boundary of her 80 acres was marked by a line of cedar posts that Pruett had apparently installed while conducting a private war with geography, because they did not align with the official survey that Edgar Chandler produced one afternoon when he rode up to the low fence she was building and looked at it with the expression of a man who had something to say but was taking his time about saying it. "Morning," he said from horseback. "Morning," Annie replied, from her knees in the dirt, a fence post driver in her hands. He was not a large man in the obvious way, not tall in the manner of men who need to be noticed. He was lean and economical, with the kind of weathered face that came from years spent doing what needed doing without much concern for comfort. He wore a plain brown hat and a canvas work shirt, and his horse was a solid bay without a single theatrical marking. He looked, Annie thought, like a man who had spent considerable time getting rid of anything unnecessary. "That post," he said, nodding at the one she had just driven, "is about 12 feet into my property." Annie sat back on her heels and looked at him with the level steadiness she had learned to produce on demand. "Is it? Survey says so." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded document with the calm certainty of a man who had been expecting this moment. "Ran it last fall. County has a copy." Annie took the document. She read it. She reread the section that mattered. She looked at the cedar posts Pruett had installed, which now had the quality of evidence in a case against a man who was no longer available to be questioned. She looked back at Edgar Chandler. "I'll move it," she said. He blinked. Whatever he had expected, argument, denial, the particular kind of frontier stubbornness that had kept county surveyors employed across 3 territories, it was apparently not that. "All right," he said. "I'll need to pull the others first and see where the true line runs," she said. "It'll take me a few days." "I can help you mark it," he said, "if you want." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That would be useful, thank you." That was the beginning. He came back the following Saturday with a transit level he had borrowed from the county assessor's office in Caldwell and a roll of string line, and they spent the better part of a morning walking the eastern boundary of her property together, driving stakes and running line and saying very little to each other, which Annie found unexpectedly comfortable. Most men, in her experience, filled silence with noise because they were afraid of what it contained. Edgar Chandler seemed to regard silence as simply another kind of weather, something you dressed appropriately for, and moved through without complaint. By noon they had established the true line, and Annie had accepted that she owed him approximately 40 feet of the garden plot she had been planning. "I am sorry about the confusion," she said, when they were done. "Pruett was a man who saw what he wanted to see," Edgar said, which seemed to be as much as he intended to say about Horace Pruett. She made coffee on the wood stove she had coaxed back to usefulness, and they sat on the porch, which was structurally sound even if it was aesthetically challenging, and she waited for the questions that usually followed first encounters. Where was she from? Where was her husband? Why was she here alone? The machinery of social expectation was reliable as a locomotive, and it always arrived at the same station. Edgar Chandler drank his coffee. He looked at the horizon. He said, "Good soil out here. That draw in the northeast corner holds moisture in a dry summer, worth planting there." Annie looked at him over her coffee cup. "I noticed that. Thought you might have," he said, and that for that day was that. He came back 2 weeks later with a load of lumber for her porch railing, which she had not asked for. He left it stacked neatly at the foot of the steps with a note that said only, "Figured you could use this." The note was unsigned because, she suspected, it had not occurred to him that it needed to be. She used the lumber. She built the railing herself, not because she was incapable of asking for assistance, but because building it herself felt important in a way she could not have fully articulated. April came and the fields opened up the way Kansas fields do, all at once, the dark soil turning rich and receptive under the spring rains. And Annie planted her first rows with the focused intensity of a woman who understands that what you put into the ground in April determines what you have to live on in February. She planted wheat in the north field, corn in the south, kitchen garden beside the house, beans, onions, beets, herbs, squash. She worked from before sunrise until the light failed. Edgar watched her from across the fence line the way a careful man watches something he is trying to understand without making it feel like surveillance. She caught him looking twice, and both times he simply nodded and went back to whatever he was doing, and she decided she could afford to find that mildly amusing rather than alarming. The first time he actually helped her with something she had not asked for help with was the pump. Her well pump seized up on a Wednesday morning in late April, and Annie spent the better part of 4 hours on her knees in the dirt beside it with a wrench and a bucket of grease and the grim determination of a woman who has learned that no one is coming to save her. She was making progress. The pump was not impossible, but it was being deliberately difficult. Edgar appeared at 2 in the afternoon on foot, carrying a canvas bag of tools. He stopped at the gate. "Heard it from my place," he said. "The sound a pump makes when the plunger seal is gone." "I am handling it," Annie said. "I know you are," he said. "Can I help anyway?" The question was phrased so simply, without any implication that she needed rescuing or that her competence was in question, that she found she had no reasonable objection to it. "Yes," she said. He had the pump working in 40 minutes. He showed her exactly what he had done, which part had failed, where to get the replacement seal in town, and how to recognize when it was beginning to fail again so she could address it before it became a crisis. He treated the information as something she was entitled to rather than something she should be grateful to receive, and Annie added that to the small, private list she had not known she was keeping. They ate supper together that evening, the first time, at her kitchen table with the window open and the spring air coming in, and the last light going pink and gold across the Kansas plain. She made salt pork and cornbread, and they talked about crops, what the local soil favored, what the market in Wichita was bearing, whether the railroad shipping rates were going to continue their present trajectory of highway robbery. It was a conversation about practical things, and it was also, Annie realized sometime during the third cup of coffee, the most genuinely comfortable conversation she had had with another human being since she had left Missouri. She did not examine that realization too closely. She put it somewhere careful and left it there. May brought a late frost that took out half her bean seedlings and all of her herbs, and Annie replanted with the stoic practicality of a woman who has learned that the land does not apologize, and neither should you. She ordered more seed from a catalog in Chicago, and while she waited for it, she walked her fields and made plans, and in the plans growing slowly, taking shape the way a structure takes shape when someone has thought carefully about foundations, was the root cellar. She needed it. She needed it badly if she was going to make this land into what she intended. A root cellar in the Kansas prairie was not a luxury. It was the difference between surviving a winter and merely enduring one. It was the difference between having enough and wondering if you would. She knew how to build one. She had helped her father dig one in Illinois when she was 12, but the proper construction, the shoring, the drainage, the framing of the door and the earthen steps required more muscle and more hands than she had available. She thought about this for 2 weeks. She thought about it the way she thought about most things that required asking for something, with the serious consideration of a woman who has learned that asking for things creates obligations, and obligations create vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are doors that certain kinds of people will walk through without knocking. But Edgar Chandler was not, as far as she could determine, that kind of person. She drew the plans on the back of a flour sack one evening after supper. Dimensions, depth, drainage slope. The position relative to the house. She was proud of the plans. They were precise. She rolled them up and walked across the field to Edgar's fence line and called out to him where he was working on his barn roof in the late afternoon light. And when he came down and unrolled the flour sack and looked at what she had drawn, something moved across his face that she caught for only a fraction of a second before his expression settled back into its customary steadiness. It was not surprise. It was something she did not yet have a name for. "You've done this before," he said. "I helped build one as a child," she said. "The plans are based on what I remember and what I have read." He studied the drawing for a long moment. "Drainage slope needs to be a hair steeper. Otherwise you'll get water pooling after a hard rain." "Show me," she said. He took the pencil from behind his ear. She had not even noticed he was carrying one and made 3 small corrections to the drawing. She studied them. He was right. She had known the drainage was the weakest part of the design, and he had found it in 30 seconds and fixed it without being grandiose about it. "Will you help me build it?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. He started the following Monday. He came every morning except Sunday, and he brought his own tools and sometimes additional lumber when she had not budgeted for it, and he worked with a steady, rhythmic purpose that she found herself organizing her days around. She would be working in the kitchen garden or the south corn field, and she would hear the sound of digging, of the wooden shore boards being fitted, of the mallet driving stakes, and the sound became something she identified as simply part of the landscape, the way the meadowlarks were part of the landscape and the wind was part of the landscape. She brought him lunch every day. Cornbread and beans, or fried salt pork and potatoes, or a cold roast chicken when she had it, and they ate together at the edge of the excavation with their backs against the dirt bank, watching the light on the grass and talking or not talking as the mood suggested. She learned things about him in the measured, slow way that you learn about someone who chooses words with care and does not volunteer information he hasn't been asked for. She learned that he was 34 years old and had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1876, having spent the better part of the preceding decade doing work he was vague about in the specific way that men are vague when the thing they are being vague about is something they would like to no longer be. She learned that he had a younger sister in Columbus who wrote to him regularly and whose letters he kept in a cigar box on his mantel. She learned that he had once wanted to be a surveyor before surveying led him to land, and land led him to farming, and farming suited him in ways that surveying had not. She learned that he had been engaged once to a woman in Ohio, and that the engagement had ended because the woman had looked at the Kansas horizon and decided she wanted no part of what lay beyond it. He said this without bitterness, which told her more about him than the story itself did. What she did not learn, because she did not ask and he did not offer, was the particular texture of his loneliness. She recognized it because she carried her own version of it, the specific weight of a person who has built a life that is sufficient and functional and deliberately sealed against the kind of connection that could compromise it. She recognized it the way you recognize a familiar accent in a stranger's speech, not with certainty, but with a resonance that suggests shared territory. She did not ask. She did not offer. She held the boundary with the same care she had used to build the fence line. But the root cellar was taking shape, beautiful, solid, practical, and something else was taking shape alongside it that Annie Sutton was not entirely managing to ignore. It happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into the building, when a thunderstorm rolled in from the northwest with no more warning than a darkening of the sky and a sudden electric smell in the air. They were both at the excavation, Edgar fitting the final shore boards on the south wall, Annie clearing the drainage channel, when the sky cracked open without preamble and dropped an inch of rain in approximately 15 minutes. They ran for the house together, which was the only sensible option, and arrived on the porch breathless and soaked through, and Annie pushed open the door, and they stood inside her kitchen dripping onto the floor she had spent a month leveling and sanding and sealing with pine tar. The rain thundered on the roof. Lightning went white across the windows. Annie went to the stove, which she had banked before going out, and coaxed it back up to heat, and she put the coffee pot on, and she found 2 of her husband's old shirts in the cedar chest she used as a linen cabinet. She had kept them not out of sentiment, but because fabric was expensive and a good cotton shirt was a good cotton shirt, and she handed one to Edgar without thinking about it. He took it, looked at it, and then looked at her with an expression she had not anticipated. "Thank you," he said. "It belonged to my husband," she said, because she was not a woman who avoided facts. "He has been dead 3 years. The shirt is just a shirt." Edgar nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been said that he wanted to acknowledge without making larger than it was. He changed his shirt in the lean-to off the kitchen, and she changed hers behind the bedroom door, and they sat at the kitchen table with their coffee while the storm made everything outside the window irrelevant. "How did he die?" Edgar asked. Not aggressively, not as an investigation, the way you ask something when the silence has made it safe to ask. Annie thought about the various answers she had given this question over the past 3 years. All of them contained a version of the truth, the way a map contains a version of the territory, accurate in the broad strokes, edited for the purposes of the traveler. "It was not straightforward," she said. Edgar waited. "He was not a good man," she said, which was the most she had said to anyone. "He died in a manner consistent with his way of living. Another man would have pressed. Another man would have located his discomfort with the incomplete answer and tried to resolve it by demanding more." Edgar Chandler looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "I am sorry it was not straightforward," which was, Annie thought, exactly the right thing to say. The storm lasted 2 hours. They talked about other things, the upcoming harvest assessments, the new grain elevator going up in Caldwell, whether the Methodist Church's plan to expand the schoolhouse was going to be funded by the county or by community subscription. The conversation was easy and ordinary, and the rain came down outside, and the stove ticked with heat, and Annie sat across the table from Edgar Chandler and felt, with a sudden alarming clarity, that she was in danger. Not the kind of danger she had spent 3 years outrunning, a different kind entirely. She told herself it was proximity. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself a number of useful and not entirely dishonest things, and when the storm cleared and Edgar went home, she stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the field, and she thought, very seriously, about the cedar box under her floorboards. The cedar box was the reason for the root cellar. Not entirely, she did need a root cellar. She was not inventing a practical need to generate a pretext. But the root cellar, positioned as she had designed it, adjacent to the east wall of the house, would allow for something she could not accomplish without it. In the cedar box were $140 in cash, a packet of documents that had been sent to her by a woman named Cecilia Morton in St. Joseph, Missouri, and 12 packets of heritage seed varieties, some of them extremely uncommon, including 2 that she was fairly certain were varieties that had been lost to commercial agriculture, but survived in private hands. The seeds were part of the work she had been doing since before she left Missouri, the work she had never told anyone about because telling anyone about it required trusting them, and trusting people required believing that trust was survivable. Cecilia Morton ran a correspondence network for women across Missouri, Kansas, and the Indian Territory, who were involved in preserving and distributing heritage seed varieties, agricultural knowledge, and in some cases considerably more political information than seed catalogs would typically contain. It was not illegal, precisely, but it was the kind of thing that drew attention, and attention was what Annie Sutton had spent 3 years most determinedly avoiding. Because Annie Sutton's husband had not been named Sutton when she married him. His name had been Thomas Reeve, and Thomas Reeve had been, among other things, an associate of men who controlled the eastern Missouri grain market through means that were not always restricted to commerce. When Thomas died, in a manner consistent with his way of living, which meant violently, and in connection with the men whose methods he had facilitated, Annie had become the kind of widow that certain people took a professional interest that was not warm. She had run. She had changed her name, which was legally uncomplicated because in 1879 a woman's name was considered an element of her social presentation rather than a point of official record in most frontier jurisdictions. She had gone west, which is what people do with pasts they need to outrun. She had found 80 acres of Kansas soil, and she had started over. The network Cecilia Morton ran had found her, or rather, Annie had found it, through a reference in a letter from a woman she had known in Illinois, and she had corresponded carefully for over a year before deciding to participate. The network was real and it was good, and the work it did mattered. But it also meant that Annie's root cellar was not only a root cellar, and the seeds she intended to grow were not only seeds. She needed the root cellar because the network used it, when the time came, when the arrangement was finalized as a depot point. Women traveling west with seed stock and documents could not always carry what they needed openly. A farmhouse with a root cellar and a woman who could be trusted was a node in a chain of custody that stretched from St. Joseph to the New Mexico territory. This was what she had not told Edgar Chandler. And Edgar Chandler, who had built the root cellar with his own hands in careful good faith, was now standing at its mouth in the July sun asking what else she was planning to grow. She told him. All of it. Not immediately, not in the first rush of the confrontation, but in the careful, sequential way that truth needs to be told when it has been held back for a long time and needs to come out in an order that makes sense. She told him about Thomas Reeve. She told him about the manner of Thomas's death, which involved a business dispute that turned lethal in the way such disputes will. She told him about the men who had subsequently considered Annie a loose end, not because she had participated in anything, but because she had been present, because she had witnessed, because the men who control things are most comfortable when the people who observe their control are not in a position to discuss it freely. She told him about Cecilia Morton and the network, which she described with the careful precision of someone who has thought very hard about how much to say about people other than themselves. She told him about the seed varieties. She pulled the cedar box out from under the floorboards right there in the kitchen while Edgar stood in the doorway looking at her with his arms folded, and his expression the unreadable whether it became when he was processing something difficult. She opened the box and spread the seed packets on the kitchen table. The root cellar, she said, is a transit point. Women from Missouri and Kansas come through with materials, seeds, documents, sometimes money, and they need a safe place to store them between stages of the journey. My property is positioned well for it. That was part of why I bought it. She stopped. She looked at him. She waited. The silence was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight. "Were you planning to tell me?" he asked. "No," she said, because she owed him honesty and she was not going to dilute it now that she had started. His jaw tightened. Not in anger, she was learning to read the particular grammar of his face, its controlled vocabulary, but in something more complicated. Something that partook of disappointment and concern and several other things she could not yet name. "I built that cellar," he said. "I know. With my hands," he said. "6 weeks of work. I know. And I built it for something you chose not to tell me about." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the seed packets on the table. He looked at the cedar box. He looked at the window and the Kansas plain beyond it and the root cellar he had built, visible through the glass, its door standing open in the summer heat. "What are these men who are looking for you?" he said. "Are they still a danger?" "I do not know," she said. "I believe I came far enough. I believe 3 years was long enough, but I do not know with certainty." "And the network," he said, "is it dangerous?" "It is not illegal," she said. "The seed preservation is entirely lawful. The documents, some of them are testimonials, records of land fraud, grain market manipulation. Distributing those could be considered politically inconvenient to certain people. Whether inconvenient translates to dangerous depends on the people. He looked back at her. "It is not fair," she said, "that I involved your work in this without telling you. I know that. I did it because I needed the root cellar and you were the only person I knew I could ask, and I had not yet decided how much to trust you." "And now," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You are the only person I have told any of this to in 3 years." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in novels with lightning and revelation. Quietly. The way the air changes when a storm has passed and you didn't realize until it was over how tense you had been. Edgar Chandler pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the seed packets. He picked up one of them, a paper envelope with a careful handwritten label, and turned it over in his fingers. "Wild garlic," he read. "Heritage variety." "It's been out of commercial production for 20 years, Annie said. "A woman in St. Joseph had seed stock going back to her grandmother. We are trying to preserve it." He set the packet down. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her, and the thing she saw in his face was not anger, and it was not judgment, and it was not the particular kind of male proprietorship that would have made him feel entitled to decide what she should have told him and when. It was worry, clean, honest worry. The kind that is directional, the kind that has an object and the object is another person. "You have been managing this alone," he said. "Yes," she said. 3 years. "Yes." "Annie," he said. And it was the first time he had used her name without Mrs. in front of it. And the way he said it was so careful and so unguarded that she felt it the way you feel a warm hand on a cold arm. "You didn't have to do that alone." She did not have a response to that. She had spent 3 years building the argument for why she did. The argument was solid and logical and had served her well. But sitting across the table from Edgar Chandler, with the seed packets between them and the root cellar visible through the window, and all the careful architecture of her secrecy dismantled and spread across the table like a harvest, she could not quite locate the argument. "I did not know you," she said at last. "No," he said, "fair. And I had reasons to not trust men with things that mattered." "Also fair," he said. He was quiet again. She waited. She had learned to wait with him. "The cellar is built," he said finally. "If you are going to use it for what you described, the latch mechanism wants some work. The current lock is not adequate for what you're proposing." Annie stared at him. "And the ventilation shaft on the north side should be hidden better," he said. "Right now it is visible from the road. If someone is looking for the kind of thing you are describing, a visible ventilation shaft is a detail that reads wrong." "Edgar," she said. "I can fix both things this week," he said. "You are not," she stopped. She tried again. "You are not obligated to be part of this." "I know I'm not," he said. "It could bring complications to your property, to your name." "I have thought about that in the last 5 minutes," he said, "and I have decided it is a risk I am willing to take." "Why?" she said. He looked at her. The storm-gray eyes were entirely direct. "Because the work is worth doing," he said, "and because I am not willing to step back from something you need." Annie looked at him for a very long time. She was searching for the angle, the hidden motive, the trap that experience had taught her to look for in offers that seemed clean. She searched carefully and completely. She found nothing. She thought that was perhaps the most frightening thing she had ever encountered. August came. The corn was tall and the wheat was in, and Edgar fixed the latch and repositioned the ventilation shaft with the meticulous competence he brought to everything. And Annie sent a letter to Cecilia Morton in St. Joseph, informing her that the Caldwell transit point was operational. The reply came in 2 weeks, via the regular mail. Written in the innocuous domestic code the network used, it read, "To any casual reader," as a letter between acquaintances discussing a recipe exchange and a church social. But to Annie it said that the first courier would arrive sometime in September, that she should expect a woman named Mrs. Porter who would ask for seed advice and that the cargo included both botanical materials and a set of documents related to land title fraud in the Cherokee Strip. She showed the letter to Edgar. She showed him the decoded version she had written out beside it. He read both. He nodded. "When is she coming?" he said. "September," Annie said. "I don't know the specific date." "All right," he said. "When she comes, if I am working across the property, signal me. I'll make myself visible." A woman traveling alone benefits from the appearance of a settled household. Annie looked at him. The warmth that moved through her chest was something she was no longer pretending, was simply gratitude. "You have thought about this," she said. "I have thought about most things regarding this property since March," he said, with a directness that left no ambiguity about what he meant. The evening after that conversation was a Thursday, and they were on Annie's porch, and the light was going long and golden across the Kansas plain the way it does in August when the heat is finally relenting, and the air turns almost sweet. They were sitting in the two chairs Annie had built from salvaged lumber. She had built them herself, which Edgar had remarked upon with genuine respect when he first saw them, and they were drinking tea because Annie had run out of coffee and hadn't yet made it to town, and Edgar had said when she apologized for the tea that he had no objection to tea. He said, in the long, comfortable silence that had become the texture of their evenings together, "I need to tell you something." Annie waited. "In Ohio," he said, "before I came here, I told you I did work I was vague about." "You did," she said. "I worked for a grain speculator," he said. "For 2 years, I ran figures for him. Contracts margins, the kind of arithmetic that looks like commerce and operates like extortion." He paused. "I was not the one making the decisions, but I was the one making the decisions possible." The parallel sat between them, quiet and obvious. "I left when I understood what the figures were actually achieving," he said, "which took me longer to understand than I would like to admit. I came to Kansas because the land seemed like a thing I could put my hands on without someone else being diminished by it." Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The documents the network is carrying include land title fraud records from the Cherokee Strip. The kind of fraud that was made possible by speculative arithmetic." "I know," he said. "I recognized the shape of it when you described it." "Is that why you said yes?" she said. "Partly," he said. "A man who has contributed to a problem has some obligation to its remedy. I believe that." "And the other part," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and the evening light was in his eyes, and he said, without any of the hedging or qualification that men in her experience used to protect themselves from the weight of what they were actually saying, "You know what the other part is, Annie." She did know. She had known for some time. She had been declining to know it, which was a different thing, but the distinction was becoming harder to maintain. "Edgar," she said carefully, "you don't have to say anything," he said. "I am not asking you for anything. I am only telling you what is true." "That is not fair," she said. "No," he said. "I know." The stars came out over Kansas one by one, the way they do out there where there is nothing to interrupt them, enormous and absolute. And they sat on the porch until the air went cool, and then Annie said good night and went inside and stood at the dark kitchen window watching him cross the field home, and she thought about what it would cost her to believe that a thing could be real. She thought about it for 2 weeks. September arrived, and with it the first courier, Mrs. Porter, who was not at all what Annie had expected, a stout, cheerful woman in her 50s, who arrived on the stage from Wichita with a trunk that contained, under the usual domestic contents, 40 packets of seed stock and a leather roll of documents that Annie received in the root cellar at 9 o'clock at night, by lamplight, while Edgar stood on the porch as arranged, looking like nothing more than a neighbor who had stopped by for coffee. Mrs. Porter stayed 2 nights. Annie fed her and gave her the bedroom, and slept on the cot in the lean-to without complaint. Edgar came by for supper on the second night and was introduced as the neighboring farmer, and was exactly what he needed to be: present, unremarkable, a piece of the settled landscape that made Mrs. Porter's presence seem ordinary. When Mrs. Porter left on the southbound stage with a receipt for the materials left in Annie's custody, Annie and Edgar stood at the root cellar in the morning and looked at what was now stored on the shelves he had built. "This is real now," Annie said. "It was always real," Edgar said. She turned and looked at him. 2 weeks of thinking had produced a conclusion she had not expected to reach, which was that the cost she had been calculating was a cost she had already paid, and the thing she had been protecting herself from was something she was already inside. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. She stopped. She tried again, the way you try again at something you haven't practiced. "I have been organizing my life around the principle that the people who matter most are the people most capable of causing harm, and that has been on the evidence, a reasonable principle." "On the evidence," he agreed. "But it has also," she said, "meant that I have spent 3 years building walls around a life that doesn't have anyone in it, and I told myself I was content with that. I told myself it was the sensible choice." "Annie," he said. "I am not content with it," she said. "I am not content with you being on the other side of a fence line when you could be." She stopped. "When I could be here," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, her work-roughened, soil-stained hand, her capable and practical hand, and held it with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the morning I watched you figure out a fence line problem with a wrench and a dead level, and the expression of someone who has decided the universe is going to cooperate whether it wants to or not." Annie made a sound that surprised her. It was, improbably, a laugh. "That was a very undignified morning," she said. "It was a magnificent morning," he said. She looked at his hand around hers. She looked at the root cellar, solid and useful and built with 6 weeks of his best work. She looked at the 80 acres of her land, the corn tall in the south field, the wheat harvested and stored, the kitchen garden going to its second planting, the fence line exactly where the county survey said it should be. "I am not a simple situation," she said. "I know that," he said. "There may still be complications from Missouri. I cannot promise there won't be." "I understand that," he said. "And the network, this is not going to stop. This is something I believe in and I intend to continue." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to stop." "Edgar," she said, and she turned toward him fully. "I am telling you all of this because I want to be honest with you. Because you have been honest with me, and because she looked at him. "I have not let myself want something in 3 years." "What do you want?" he said, and his voice was quiet and careful and entirely without pressure. She looked at his face, the weathered, economical, unguarded face of a man who had done hard things and knew what they cost and come out the other side of them without losing the part that made him decent, and she said, "I want this to be something real." He brought her hand up and pressed it against his jaw and held it there, and the morning light was long and golden across the Kansas plain, and the root cellar stood solid and true between the house and the fence line. "It is already something real," he said. "It has been real since March." October brought the harvest in full, and Edgar brought his wagon, and they worked Annie's fields together in the long days of autumn, and the work had a different quality now. Or rather, it was the same work, but Annie was no longer managing the careful distance she had been maintaining across it. They talked while they worked. They argued sometimes about methods and priorities and the optimal way to sort the seed corn, and the arguments had the productive texture of two people who respect each other's competence and are not afraid of disagreement. At the end of the harvest days, they sat on the porch in the cooling evenings, and Edgar's hand found hers as naturally as if it had always been there, and Annie leaned her shoulder against his and looked at the darkening sky and felt, cautiously and then less cautiously, and then without caution at all, something that she identified as peace. Caldwell noticed. Caldwell was a town of approximately 800 people in 1882, and a town of 800 people in Kansas notices when a widow and her bachelor neighbor begin sitting on the porch together in the evenings. Mrs. Dorothy Crane brought it up at the church auxiliary in October with the transparent pretense of concern, and Annie, who was present at the meeting, looked at Mrs. Crane with the level steadiness she had learned to produce on demand and said that she and Mr. Chandler were neighbors and friends, and that she was grateful for his assistance with her property, and the meeting moved on. What Mrs. Crane could not have known, what no one in Caldwell knew, was that, on the previous Saturday evening, Edgar had kissed Annie for the first time on the porch in the starlight, with the Kansas wind in the grass and the root cellar a dark shape against the earth, and that Annie had kissed him back with the full and unhesitating commitment of a woman who has decided to stop being afraid of the things she wants. The kiss had been quiet. Everything about Edgar was quiet. But it had been thorough, and it had been certain, and when they separated Annie was surprised to find that her hands were shaking, not with fear, for the first time in a very long time, but with something that was its exact opposite. "All right," she had said, which was not the most romantic thing that had ever been said in the history of the frontier, but Edgar had looked at her and smiled a real smile, not the careful neutral expression, but the one she had seen occasionally when something pleased him genuinely, and said, "All right." The second courier came in November, a younger woman named Ruth Yates who was traveling alone with a child, a boy of about 3, and who was not merely carrying seed stock. Ruth Yates was herself in some difficulty, a land fraud situation in the Cherokee Strip that had left her without her husband's homestead claim, and with very little legal standing and a great deal of determination. She was carrying documents related to her own case as well as materials for the network, and she arrived at Annie's door in a state of exhausted, dignified distress that Annie recognized from the inside. Annie put Ruth and the child in the bedroom and made soup, and listened to Ruth's situation with the careful attention of someone who had thought about legal mechanisms and land title fraud considerably more than most people found comfortable. Then she went to Edgar. She laid out the situation and the documents and said, "I know you understand this kind of arithmetic better than I do. What does this say?" He read the documents for 20 minutes in silence. Then he said, "This is a fraudulent survey claim. The original homestead filing is valid. Someone refiled using a surveying error that should have been caught by the county clerk and wasn't. Can it be corrected?" Annie said. "It can be contested," he said, "with the right legal support and the right documentation, which she appears to have." He looked at the documents again. "The county seat in Sumner County has a land office. If she files a contest with these supporting materials and if someone accompanies her who can speak to the surveying irregularity, you could speak to it," Annie said. He looked at her. "You know surveying," she said. "You ran the line on my property. You know exactly what a fraudulent survey error looks like because you know what an accurate one looks like." The silence was brief. "Yes," he said, "I could speak to it." He went with Ruth Yates to the Sumner County Land Office on a Wednesday in November, and he sat across from the land office examiner, and he explained, with careful technical precision, exactly how the survey error had been manufactured and how it could be verified against the original township records. The examiner, who was a methodical man, asked questions. Edgar answered them. The process took 4 hours. 2 weeks later, Ruth Yates received notice that her contest had been accepted for review. 3 months after that, by which time she had moved on to relatives in New Mexico, the contest was resolved in her favor and the fraudulent claim was vacated. Annie received the news in a letter from Cecilia Morton, who had been tracking the case. Annie read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it across to Edgar and watched his face as he read it. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The winter of 1882 came down hard on Kansas, the way Kansas winters do when they are determined to make a point. The snow piled against the fence lines, and the north wind found every gap in every wall, and Annie was grateful for the root cellar, genuinely, straightforwardly grateful, not for its role in the network, but for the practical, essential thing it was, the shelter of vegetables and preserved foods that meant she ate well through the long, cold months. Edgar came over for supper often enough that it stopped requiring an occasion. He helped her when the cold cracked the water pipe between the well and the house, and they spent a cold, miserable morning, replacing it with their breath steaming in the air, and their fingers going numb even through their gloves. He helped her bank the foundation against the worst of the cold wind, packing straw along the north wall of the house, with the methodical competence of a man who takes winter seriously. In return, she mended his shirts, because she could sew and he openly admitted he could not, and she kept a portion of whatever she was cooking set aside for him, because she had noticed, over the summer, that Edgar Chandler ate whatever was in front of him without much apparent discrimination, which suggested that left to his own devices he ate what was expedient rather than what was nourishing. She said this to him one evening in December, and he looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as the one that preceded something real. "You pay attention to me," he said. "I notice things," she said. "It is a habit." "You notice things about me specifically," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the snow was coming down in the quiet way that deep winter snow comes down when it has all night to do it. "Yes," she said, "I do." He looked at her for a long, deliberate moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." Annie's heartbeat measured a pause. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a held breath. "I want to ask you," he said, "if you would consider marrying me. Not because it is the expected thing, and not because it would simplify the social complications of the current arrangement, but because I want to build something with you that is larger than a fence line and a root cellar. And because I believe you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and I would like to be allowed to tell you that every day for the foreseeable future." The kitchen was very quiet. "Edgar," she said. "You can say no," he said with complete steadiness. "Nothing changes if you say no. I will still be here." She looked at him, the man who had fixed her pump and built her root cellar and stood in the land office for 4 hours for a woman he had never met before that week, and held her hand in the evening dark without asking her to be anything other than what she was. "I am a complicated situation," she said for the second time. "I know," he said. "I like complicated situations. They generally contain things worth knowing." "I am not always easy to be close to," she said. "I have noticed," he said, "that difficult things are usually the things worth doing." Annie looked at the snow outside the window. She thought about Missouri and Thomas Reeve and 3 years of running, and the careful sealed life she had built around her fear. She thought about 80 acres of Kansas soil, and a root cellar with a corrected drainage slope, and the cedar box full of seeds. She thought about what it meant to plant something in ground you intended to stay in. "Yes," she said. Edgar's face underwent a brief, complete transformation, all the controlled weather of it opening into something unguarded and warm and entirely real. And then he reached across the table and took both her hands. "I will make you a good life," he said. "I cannot promise that it will not have difficulties. But I can promise that I will be honest with you and that I will not ask you to be less than you are." "That is exactly the right promise to make," she said. They were married in March of 1883, 1 year after Annie Sutton had arrived on the southbound stage from Wichita with $43 and a box of seed catalogs, and a past she was outrunning. The ceremony was at the First Methodist Church, performed by Reverend Alderman, attended by the people of Caldwell who had watched the situation with interest for the better part of a year. Mrs. Dorothy Crane was in the front pew wearing an expression that had settled, somewhat grudgingly, into approval. There were wildflowers, because it was March and the Kansas plain was coming back to life after the winter, and Annie wore a dress she had made from deep green wool, because she did not believe in white for second weddings, and the green was the color of things growing, which seemed appropriate. Edgar wore a suit he had ordered from a catalog in Wichita, charcoal gray, and he stood at the front of the church with the same steady, unhurried quality he brought to all things. And when Annie came up the aisle, he looked at her with an expression so open and undefended that she felt her throat tighten with something she had no intention of calling anything other than happiness. The Reverend said the words. They said their words in return, clear and certain. And when it was done, Edgar kissed her once, briefly and entirely, and the congregation applauded with genuine warmth because, whatever the complications of their situation, the people of Caldwell could recognize the real thing when they saw it. The reception was at Annie's house. Their house now, with food contributed by the church auxiliary, and a fiddle player named Jim Dawes who played for 3 hours without apparent diminution of enthusiasm. People came and went on the porch and through the kitchen and spilled out into the yard in the mild March afternoon, and at one point Annie found herself standing alone at the edge of the yard looking at the root cellar and thinking about the morning Edgar had stood at its mouth and asked his question. She heard him behind her before she saw him. He came to stand beside her, and they both looked at the root cellar with its solid pine door and iron hinges and the concealed ventilation shaft on the north side. Thinking about something, he said. The day you asked me what else I was planning to grow, she said. Ah, he said. You knew, she said, that day. You already knew something was not right. You had known for a while. I knew, he said. I did not know what, but I knew the root cellar was not the whole answer to the question. Why didn't you push before that, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Because you were going to tell me when you were ready, he said, and I believed that you would be ready. She looked at him. The afternoon light was on his face, the weathered, economical face she knew now with the intimacy of daily proximity and love. That was a considerable act of faith, she said. It was, he agreed. It was not unfounded. He took her hand and they went back to the party, and Jim Dawes launched into a reel, and Annie danced with Edgar in the yard of their own house, while the Kansas spring light went long and golden, and the guests clapped and the fiddles sang. The spring of 1883 was a good one. They worked the fields together now with the ease of two people who have stopped performing industriousness for each other and are simply doing the work, and the 80 acres yielded its best early planting yet. The corn went in straight and true, the wheat came up strong in the north field, and the kitchen garden was Annie's particular pride, a testament to what she could coax from soil she had now spent a year learning. She put in the heritage seed varieties from the cedar box, the ones she had been holding carefully through the winter. The wild garlic came up first, in April, in the sheltered bed on the south wall of the house. She crouched over it one morning and felt something so large and simple she almost laughed, the satisfaction of a thing that had been held in potential for a long time and was now under her hands becoming real. Edgar came to look. He crouched beside her. Wild garlic, he said. Heritage variety, she said. 20 years out of commercial production. He looked at the slender green shoots pushing up from the dark soil. Something someone's grandmother kept, he said. Yes, she said. And now we are keeping it. He looked at her. We, he said, with a quality to it that she had come to recognize as the way he said things that mattered to him most, quietly, without fanfare, as if the word itself was sufficient and did not need decoration. We, she confirmed. A letter came from Cecilia Morton in May. The Cherokee strip land fraud case that Ruth Yates' documents had been part of had been formally investigated by the Federal Land Office, and 3 of the fraudulent claims had been vacated and the claimants prosecuted. One of the surveyors involved had turned state's evidence and named the speculator behind the scheme, who was facing federal indictment. Annie read the letter twice. She carried it to the field where Edgar was working and she read it to him and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished he stood with his hands on the fence post and looked at the horizon. That was worth doing, he said. Yes, she said. Ruth Yates gets her land. She does, Annie said. And other women who were defrauded in the same scheme get some remedy as well. Edgar nodded. Then he looked at her and said, "Write back to Mrs. Morton. Tell her the Caldwell transit point is continuing to operate and that there is now a second person here who can verify surveying records if needed." Annie looked at him. "You are volunteering." "I have the skill," he said. "And as we have established, a skill in the service of something unjust is a debt." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and walked back to Edgar and put her arms around him there in the Kansas field in the May morning and held on with both hands. He held her back, steady as everything about him, his chin at her temple and the sun warm on their backs. "I love you," she said. She had said it before. She had been saying it since February in the gradual and thorough way that Annie Sutton did everything. But she said it each time with full attention, the way she said everything she meant. "I love you," he said into her hair. He said it the same way every time without flourish, with complete conviction. By June, Annie knew she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for one morning, private and astonished, walking the fields with her hand pressed flat against her abdomen as if she could already communicate something through it. Then she went and found Edgar repairing the barn roof and called up to him, and he came down and she told him. He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down on the barn step and put his face in his hands, and she thought for one alarmed second that the response was negative, before she realized the sound coming from behind his hands was not distress, but something entirely opposite. "Edgar," she said. He looked up. His eyes were wet, which was the only time she had seen anything like that, and his face had the open, unguarded quality she associated with the moments when he was most completely himself. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He stood up and pulled her carefully into his arms and held her with such delicacy and such absolute intention that she laughed. She couldn't help it and pressed her face into his shoulder. "I will not break," she said. "I know you will not," he said. "This is for me, not for you." She laughed again and held on. The summer of 1883 was the fullest summer Annie had known since she was a child in Illinois, before the war changed things. The pregnancy was straightforward. She had the constitution, her mother had always said, of a draft horse, which she had always taken as the compliment it was intended to be. And she worked the gardens and corresponded with the network and managed 2 more courier transits through the route Cellar with the efficient competence of a woman who knows how to hold multiple things at once. Edgar watched over her with the careful, unobtrusive attention of a man who has decided that protecting someone and respecting their agency are not contradictions. He did not wrap her in cotton wool. He did not take over her work or suggest she should do less. He simply paid attention and was there, and occasionally, when she was tired and did not say so, he would bring the supper to her rather than waiting for her to make it, and he would sit beside her and make no remark on the fact. October came. The harvest went well, better than the first year, the land responding to the second season of careful tending. The corn was excellent. The wheat yielded at a rate that made the Caldwell grain elevator operator look twice at the receipts. And in late October, on a Wednesday that arrived with the first hard frost of the season glittering on the grass, Annie went into labor with the thoroughness and determination she brought to all things she undertook. Mrs. Hartwell, the wife of the dry goods store owner, had agreed to attend, as had the local doctor, a young man named Dr. Ellison, who had come to Caldwell from Cincinnati 2 years prior and who was, Annie had decided, fundamentally sensible. Edgar sat in the kitchen through the long hours with his hands around a coffee cup, and the expression of a man who is maintaining composure through the application of significant effort. At 4 in the morning the baby arrived, healthy and loud and indignant about it, and Mrs. Hartwell said, "It's a boy," with the satisfaction of a woman who has attended a great many of these events and has not lost her appreciation for them. And Edgar was allowed into the bedroom to find Annie sitting up in bed with the ferocity of recent combat still in her eyes and a red-faced infant boy in her arms. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at them for a long moment. "Come here," Annie said. He came. He sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has made a decision, and Edgar held his son with the focused, competent attention he brought to everything, and the baby regarded him with the ancient, assessing gaze that newborns have, as if they are reviewing the record and determining whether it is satisfactory. "James," Annie said. "I would like to call him James." Edgar looked at her. "After your father." "After both of them," she said. He knew her father's name. She had told him the whole story by now. The Illinois childhood and the farm and the war and the way her father had come back from it with the edges of him different. Your father was named James as well. I looked at your sister's letters. He looked at her. You looked at my sister's letters. The outside of the envelopes, she said. The return address says James Chandler, which is your father, and Ellen Chandler, which is your sister. I did not read them. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the baby. James is a good name, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at their son, whose face was settling from indignation into the pure vacancy of deep sleep. We have built something, she said. We have, he agreed. The land is good, she said. The cellar is solid. The networks are growing, and now this. And now this, he said. She reached up and touched his jaw, the familiar weathered line of it, and he turned and kissed her forehead, and outside the frost lay silver and silent on the Kansas plain, and the stars went on in their enormous indifference, and none of that mattered at all. Edgar's sister Ellen came to visit in the spring of 1884, making the journey from Columbus by rail to Wichita, and then stage to Caldwell, arriving with 3 trunks and the energy of a woman who had been corresponding with her brother for years, and was now going to see the situation with her own eyes. She was 28, cheerful and direct, with Edgar's gray eyes and considerably less of his economy of expression. She and Annie recognized each other in approximately 30 seconds. The recognition of 2 women who have built themselves into exactly the shape they intended regardless of what anyone else thought about the project. And by the end of the first evening, they were deep in a conversation about seed varieties and agricultural correspondence networks that lasted well past midnight, while Edgar sat in the corner with James on his knee reading a copy of the Kansas Farmer with the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. Ellen stayed 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she helped Annie replant the herb garden, wrote 3 letters to women in Ohio about the seed preservation network, held James for entire afternoons while Annie worked, and told Edgar approximately 15 things he had apparently needed to hear from his younger sister, none of which Annie was privy to, but all of which seemed, from Edgar's subsequent behavior, to have been well considered. The last evening before Ellen left, the 3 of them sat on the porch in the April warmth, and Edgar got out the bottle of whiskey he kept for occasions, and they had a glass each, and Ellen said, looking at the Kansas plain with the consideration of a woman evaluating something carefully, "I understand now why you stayed." Edgar looked at her. "I didn't before," she said. "I thought it was stubbornness. The I will make this work or it will kill me variety. You have always had that." "I have," he agreed. "But it isn't stubbornness," she said. "It's that all of this," she waved her hand at the fields, the root cellar, Annie, the lamplit house behind them, "is what you were aiming at. You just had to get here." Edgar looked at Annie over his sister's head. "That is approximately right," he said. Ellen went back to Columbus with a cedar box of mixed seed varieties and a letter of introduction to a woman in Cleveland who was part of a correspondence network there. The network was growing, branching into new territories, carrying its particular kind of quiet work across larger distances. Annie managed the Caldwell node with the efficiency and care she brought to all the things she was responsible for, and Edgar provided the surveying expertise when it was needed, and the solid visible presence of a settled household when that was what the couriers required. 2 men came through Caldwell in the summer of 1884 who made Annie's stomach tighten with the old instinct, the one that had kept her alive through Missouri and across 3 years of careful rebuilding. They were from St. Louis, or so they said, looking for a woman named Reeve who was owed some property settlement from her late husband's estate. Annie heard about this from Dorothy Crane, who had heard it from the barkeep at the Drover's Rest, and she went home and stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table for 3 minutes, calculating. Thomas Reeves Associates. 3 years had not been enough distance, or perhaps they had developed new reasons. The property settlement story was a fiction. Thomas had died insolvent, deliberately, having liquidated whatever was legally attachable before his particular end caught up with him. There was no estate. There was no settlement. There were men who wanted to know where Annie was and what she knew, and perhaps what she had taken with her when she left. The answer to the last question was documents. In the cedar box along with the seeds, there had been letters in Thomas Reeves' hand, correspondence that implicated men in St. Louis in the grain market manipulation that had formed Thomas's principal occupation. She had taken them because they had seemed like a kind of insurance. She had not known when she took them that they would end up in the same box as heritage seed varieties and network correspondence. She told Edgar that evening. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. "I told you everything in July of last year. I am telling you this now because these men are a complication I did not anticipate." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are the letters?" "In the root cellar," she said. "In the cedar box on the second shelf." He stood up. She followed him to the root cellar, and he opened the cedar box and looked at the letters. There were 6 of them, tied with a piece of string, and he looked at them the way he looked at survey documents, with the precise attention of someone who understands what they are actually looking at. "These," he said, "are the documentation for a federal case." "Yes," she said, "that was my calculation. If you submit these to the Federal Land Office or to the U.S. Marshal's office, the men they implicate lose all interest in finding you," he said. "Because you become a witness in a federal matter, which makes harming you a federal crime of the specific and attention-drawing variety that people in the grain speculation business prefer to avoid." Annie looked at him. "That is exactly what I was thinking," she said. "You were always going to do this," he said. "Eventually." "I was waiting until I was sure of my position," she said. "My legal name, my residency, my documented presence here as Annie Chandler, all of that creates a chain of identity that makes me harder to simply make disappear." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp was between them, and the root cellar smelled of earth and stored vegetables and the particular clean smell of pine boards. "You were always several steps ahead," he said. "I have had to be," she said. "You don't have to be alone about it," he said. She reached out and took his hand. "I know that now." He rode to Wichita on a Monday with the 6 letters, accompanied by a written statement from Annie Chandler née Sutton née Reeve. She had decided that clarity was, at this point, the most powerful form of self-defense, and presented them at the office of the U.S. Marshal for the District of Kansas. The Marshal, a man named Horace Webb who had spent 15 years developing a healthy professional interest in the activities of the St. Louis grain market, read the letters with the attention of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of document. The process was not instant. These things never are. It took 4 months of correspondence and legal machinery, and the careful work of people in federal offices who understood that the kind of case these letters supported was the kind that needed to be built correctly, or it would not hold. But in December of 1884, Annie received a formal letter from the U.S. Marshal's office informing her that her sworn deposition had been accepted, that she had the status of a protected federal witness in the ongoing investigation of grain market fraud activities in Missouri and eastern Kansas, and that the men who had been asking about her in Caldwell had been located and were themselves now the subjects of inquiry. She read this letter at the kitchen table. James was in the yard under Edgar's supervision, conducting a serious investigation of a caterpillar he had discovered on the fence post. Annie could hear Edgar's voice through the window, explaining the caterpillar with the thoroughness he brought to all questions James asked. She folded the letter. She held it in her hands for a moment. 3 years of running, 1 year of building, 1 year of being for the first time in her adult life completely where she intended to be. She went to the window. "Edgar," she called. He looked up. James looked up also, still holding the caterpillar with solemn care. "It is done," she said. "The Marshal's office, it is done." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said something to James that she couldn't hear, and he walked to the house and came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Done," he said. "Done," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed. The Caterpillar investigation continued audibly outside the window, conducted now at James's own direction, which was the prerogative of a 14-month-old who has decided that his father's brief absence is the opportunity for independent research. Annie laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep, from relief and love and the specific absurdity of important moments happening alongside small ones, and Edgar laughed with her, and they stood in their kitchen in the December Kansas afternoon and let it go. The winter of 1884 was milder than the one before it, and the house, which Edgar had spent 2 years systematically rebuilding from the soft-floored wreck that Horace Pruett had sold to Annie, held the warmth with the confidence of a structure that has been rightly considered and properly executed. The root cellar kept their stores perfectly: the potatoes, the carrots, the beets, the preserved beans, the smoked pork, the heritage seeds resting in their labeled envelopes waiting for spring, and when the January cold came sharp and bright, they were amply provided for. The network continued its work. Annie managed correspondence, received and forwarded materials, hosted 3 more courier transits through the winter. She and Cecilia Morton exchanged letters regularly now, the real letters alongside the coded ones, because the federal involvement had changed the nature of certain risks and relaxed others. Cecilia was, in person. Annie had never met her but had come to know her through 2 years of correspondence. A woman of formidable intelligence and dry humor and profound commitment to the work. Annie wrote to her in January describing the resolution of the Missouri situation, and Cecilia wrote back with the thoroughness and warmth of a woman who understood exactly what the resolution meant. "You are free now. Not that you weren't before. You have always been free in the ways that matter. But now the world knows it too." Annie read this letter to Edgar over breakfast, and he nodded in the particular way he nodded when something had been said well and required no addition, and she put the letter in the correspondence box and went back to her coffee and the day's work. In February, Annie realized she was pregnant again, with the same combination of astonishment and satisfaction she had felt the first time. She was 29 years old and healthy, and the Kansas prairie had proven, over 2 years, to be the ground she had needed all along. She told Edgar immediately this time, not because she was certain it would hold, as the first months of pregnancy were always uncertain, but because she had made a choice somewhere in the past 2 years to stop managing information as a protective mechanism within her own home. Edgar received the news with the same open, unguarded quality as the first time, the brief stillness, and then the warmth spreading across the controlled weather of his face like sun through clouds, and he said, "James is going to be terrible about this for approximately 6 months, and then he is going to be devoted." Annie laughed. 6 months is probably generous. "He is very committed to his own status," Edgar said, with the particular pride of a man who has noticed that his son has opinions. The spring of 1885 came with exceptional warmth, and the fields opened up with the generosity that good soil offers when it has been properly tended for 3 consecutive seasons. Annie's third planting was her best. The heritage varieties she had been cultivating were now established: the wild garlic in its 2nd year of permanent bed, the corn varieties she had selected for local adaptation performing at rates that made the neighbors take notice. Edgar expanded the upper field by 8 acres, breaking new ground to the north with the methodical, season-long effort that breaking prairie sod required, and they planted it in the fall with a winter wheat variety that Cecilia Morton had sent from Missouri, an older cultivar with better cold resistance than the commercial stock. The baby came in August, another boy, strong and determined from the first moment. They named him Samuel, after no one in particular, but with the sense that the name suited what he clearly intended to be. James, who was 22 months old and had indeed spent several months regarding the pregnancy with deep suspicion, took one look at Samuel in Edgar's arms and reached up with both hands to be included, which was, Annie thought, a more gracious resolution than she had expected. Caldwell, Kansas in 1885 was a different town than the one Annie had arrived in 3 years before, larger, more settled, with a new school building and a bank, and a newspaper that covered local events with the enthusiasm of a publication that intends to be taken seriously. The railroad spur that connected Caldwell to the main line had brought more settlers and more commerce, and the general sense that the frontier was becoming something other than frontier. Annie was a known figure in Caldwell now, in the way that people become known in small communities through the accumulation of ordinary time and ordinary good faith. She sold vegetable produce from her kitchen garden at the Saturday market from June through October, and people came specifically for her heritage variety seeds, which she offered in small packets with handwritten growing notes. She had, without quite intending it, become a resource. She was also, among the women who knew about such things, understood to be a node in a correspondence network that did useful work. And this understanding was shared in the quiet way that women share information about things that matter without announcements, through suggestion and implication, and the reliable transmission channel of mutual trust. Several women in Caldwell and the surrounding county had become part of the extended network by 1885, not couriers or agents but correspondents, growers, keepers of seed stock. Annie held the connection between them with the same care she brought to all the things she held. On a Saturday in September of 1885, Annie and Edgar went to the market together with James on Edgar's shoulders and Samuel in the carrier Annie had made from sturdy canvas, and they set up their produce table and sold heritage seed packets and preserved goods, and talked to the people of Caldwell about the harvest and the price of grain and the new schoolhouse construction, and the morning was ordinary and warm and complete. Dorothy Crane stopped at the table and bought 3 packets of seed wild garlic, heritage bean, winter squash, and she looked at Annie with the expression that had finally, over 3 years, settled into something genuine. "You have done well here," she said. It was, from Mrs. Crane, essentially a civic proclamation. "Thank you," Annie said. "It is a good place." Mrs. Crane moved on. Edgar appeared at Annie's shoulder with 2 cups of coffee from the woman 3 tables down who made it on a portable stove and sold it by the cup, and he handed one to Annie, and they stood behind their table in the Saturday market and drank their coffee and watched their town go about its business. James, from his position on Edgar's shoulders, delivered a commentary on the passing scene with the authority of someone who considers elevation to be a form of expertise. "He will be unbearable when he can actually talk," Annie said. "He is already fairly committed," Edgar said. Annie looked up at her son, who had located a competitor's produce table and was describing it with great conviction to anyone who would listen. Then she looked at Edgar, who was looking at her with the particular expression she had been seeing for 2 years, the one that had no hedging in it, no qualification, no managed distance. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking," he said, "about March of 1882, when you pulled a fence post 12 feet into my property and looked at me like I was the one with the problem." "I had not seen the survey," she said. "You absolutely had not," he said. "You were entirely ready to be right." "I frequently am right," she said. "You frequently are," he agreed. "That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was the way you looked at the soil." "How did I look at it?" "Like it was something you already loved," he said, "before you knew whether it was going to love you back." Annie was quiet for a moment. The market moved around them, voices and boots and the particular Kansas September smell of dust and harvest and coming cold. "It did love me back," she said. "It did," he agreed. "Most things do, given time and attention and someone willing to put the work in." She looked at him, the weathered economical face she knew now with the intimacy of daily life and marriage, and 2 children, and 3 years of shared purpose. She knew the line his jaw made in the morning light, and the way his hands looked at the end of a day of work, and the specific quality of his attention when something mattered to him. She knew what it cost him to say what he meant, and she knew that he said it anyway, every time, because he had decided that honesty was not optional. She reached out and took his hand, there in the Saturday market, in front of Caldwell, Kansas, in front of everyone. "What else are you planning to grow?" he said, with a quality she recognized as the gentle echo of that July morning 2 years ago, returned now without its tension, without its hidden stakes, with only the lightness of two people who no longer have anything to conceal from each other. She considered the question with the full seriousness she brought to all serious questions. "More garlic," she said. "The heritage bean varieties Cecilia sent in July. Another kitchen garden bed on the east side once the drainage is managed. The winter wheat in the new north field." She paused. "The network expanding into the territory if the roots can be secured. The children, this." She squeezed his hand. "All of this." He looked at her. The morning light was on the market square, and James was still holding court from his elevation, and Samuel had fallen asleep in the canvas carrier, with the absolute conviction of a baby who has decided the current situation is sufficient. And the Kansas sky went on overhead in that particular autumn blue that is the color of a thing that has been resolved. "All of this," Edgar said, with the complete and unhurried certainty that was his most fundamental quality, the one she had recognized from the beginning and built her trust on and built her life around. She leaned her shoulder against his. He pressed back, steady and warm. The market went on. The town went on. The 80 acres outside Caldwell waited with the patient generosity of ground that has been given what it needed and is now simply being what it is. The root cellar was full. The seed packets were in their envelopes, labeled with Annie's careful hand. The heritage varieties were in their second and third seasons of establishment, cross-referencing themselves quietly with the Kansas soil, becoming something adapted and local and permanent. The letters from Cecilia and the other correspondents filled a box in the sitting room where they could be reached without drama. The federal case was closed, and the names in Thomas Reeves' letters were being prosecuted innocent. Louis Court and Annie Chandler was a documented witness in a completed matter who had nothing further to run from. James reached down and patted the top of Edgar's hat with the proprietary authority of a 2-year-old who has determined that this particular location is his. Edgar said, without looking up, "That is my hat." James considered this position and appeared to disagree with it. Annie laughed full and free, the way she had learned to laugh in the last 2 years, in the way that comes when you are no longer conserving your joy against possible future shortage, and Edgar laughed with her. And the Saturday market of Caldwell, Kansas in September of 1885 went about its ordinary and sufficient business. She had come here with $43 and a dark past, and a plan for 80 acres of Kansas soil, and a root cellar she had needed built. She had grown considerably more than she had planned.